Hello, my name's Randy Bush, and welcome to these little podcasts we're calling Into the Words. Each week we look at a different book, some fiction, some nonfiction, to explore both themes of faith and life through the writings. Several years ago I was walking through Powell's bookstore in Portland, Oregon, a marvelous place, and saw on a table a small book called 7 Brief Lessons on Physics by a quantum physicist named Carlo Rovelli. The book literally is very thin. I kept walking past it and my eye kept coming back to it. I was a music major, not a science major, but I must admit that I've always had a certain fascination with physicists, and particularly their descriptions of the universe. And I thought, well, a book that small must be accessible even for a music major. So I went ahead and purchased it. Books on science can be a little bit of a challenge for non-science people, in the sense that to cover the topics usually involves either theories or mathematics or both, and that can be daunting. Probably one of the most famous science books to make it in the American book scene was A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. It was a big bestseller, although I would wager it was more widely bought than widely read. It became somewhat dense near the latter part of the book. In the years since, though, other people have written marvelous books about the nature of the universe and physics. Authors like Brian Greene and Lisa Randall and Neil deGrasse Tyson from the Hayden Planetarium has talked about space. So there are accessible books. So I would point to 2 books by Carlo Rovelli. The 7 Brief Lessons on Physics is a good primer about physics and basic concepts. It is very accessible. But the one I'm going to speak from today is another book of his called The Order of Time. Time itself is a fascinating concept. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, started with the recognition that space and time are the 2 constructs that humans have created in order to understand their place in the universe. Time has always been a mysterious force, and in many ways not as straightforward as we would assume. And that becomes quite clear in Rovelli's book. Rovelli was born in 1956. He's an Italian. He's taught in both Italy and the United States, and now he's currently a professor in Marseille in France. He's a quantum gravity specialist and a theoretical physicist. But I wanted to just offer some of his thoughts about time itself. The perception is that time is something that exists independent of us, something that can be easily measured, and we find ourselves through using time as a reference for our broader lives. But Rovelli, as a physicist, would remind us that actually time is a little different from that. And so he offers some perspectives to help us understand fresh ways that we can relate to the concept of time. So to begin with, he points that Einstein realized that time is both slowed down by mass as well as by speed. So therefore time is not a constant as much as it is something that is variable. And then he went on to talk about an example of how to understand the difficulty in pinpointing a moment in time. He says, imagine that your sister lives on a distant planet, the planet Proxima b, and light takes 4 years to reach you from that planet. If you looked at her through a telescope, or if you received a radio communication from her, you would know what she was doing 4 years ago, rather than what she is doing now. Because now on Proxima b is definitely not what you see through the telescope or what you could hear from her voice over the radio. There's no special moment on Proxima b that corresponds to what constitutes the present here and now. Dear reader, pause for a moment, let this sink in. It's perhaps the most astounding conclusion arrived at in the whole of contemporary physics. The notion of the present refers to things that are close to us, not to anything that is far away. Our present does not extend throughout the universe. Rather, it's like a bubble around us. That may be a hard concept to initially grasp, but it points to the vastness of the universe and how our understandings of motion are very much restricted to this realm, particularly when it comes to being measured in a constant variable like time. Then he goes on. Aristotle was the first we are aware of to have asked himself the question, what is time? And he came to the following conclusion. Time is the measurement of change, because things change continually. We call time the measurement, the counting of these changes. So suddenly Rovelli's entertained a different concept entirely. The idea of time not being a constant, but the measurement of change. And let me say more about that from his writing. As we said, time, as Aristotle suggested, is the measurement of change. Different variables can be chosen to measure that change, and none of them has all the characteristics of time as we experience it. But this does not alter the fact that the world is in a ceaseless process of change. We can think of the world as made up of things, of substances, of entities, of something that is, or we can think of the world as made up of events, of happenings, of processes, of things that occur. Something that does not last, that undergoes continual transformation, that is not permanent in time. The destruction of the notion of time in fundamental physics is the crumbling of the first of these two perspectives, not of the second. It's a realization of the ubiquity of impermanence, not of stasis in a motionless time. The difference between things and events is that things persist in time, but events have a limited duration. But we cannot think of the physical world as if it were made of things. It just doesn't work. What works instead is thinking about the world as a network of events. And then he gives these great examples. He says simple events, or more complex events that can be dissembled into combinations of simpler ones, are what make up time in this world. A few examples. War is not a thing, it's a sequence of events. A storm is not a thing, it's a collection of occurrences. A cloud above a mountain is not a thing, it's the condensation of humidity in the air that the wind blows over the mountain. A wave is not a thing, it is a movement of water, and the water that forms it is always different. A family is not a thing. It's a collection of relations, occurrences, feelings. And a human being? Of course it's not a thing. Like the cloud above the mountain, it's a complex process where food, information, light, words, and so on enter and exit. It's a knot of knots in a network of social relations, in a network of chemical processes, in a network of emotions exchanged with its own kind. We understand the world by studying change, not by studying things. The book goes on to explore this idea in more detail, but I find it a fascinating concept, and actually a biblical concept. To talk about God and eternity is to talk about what God values and who God is. And God is love. God is spirit. God is truth. That is less a thing and more an event, a relation. And so in thinking about time, even eternal time, it's helpful to imagine that as the exploration of deep and loving relations, where change and variability is part of it, but it still remains a constant, something we can trust. So take a bold chance, pull a book about physics off a shelf, explore the wonders of this universe that God has made, and people like Rovelli help us explore. Thank you for joining me for this moment as we go into the words.